Welcome to Uncovered, the Bible as historical document. You probably know the Bible as a religious book. Maybe you even own one or read one. But at its core, it is a collection of ancient primary manuscripts. In this show, we will examine the Bible from the perspective of a historian to examine its historicity and manuscript strength, to see if we can uncover why the founders of the United States thought this book held value for the construction of our civic system. Our host is history professor and theologian Dr. Carl Kriesman. Joining Carl is Matthew Porter, a writer, director, and creative executive.
Hey, Matthew.
Hey, Carl.
Man, how are you doing, buddy?
I could not be doing better.
It is great. I'm glad to be back here one last time.
That's it.
At least for now.
Yep.
At least for now. Yeah, there's no planned bonus episodes, listeners. Some of you are like, you did like a bunch of, I had one that I said it was going to be a reach, and I haven't even tried, quite honestly. So you never know. But we have one last episode. Just wanted to, I think we've gotten where we wanted to get to. Yeah.
Landed the plane.
What'd you call the last one? You said it was like our live album.
Was it Frampton Comes
Alive?
Alive?
Frampton Comes Alive. That's right.
We're going double album.
Yeah, it was a little long. But we're gonna. We were making the case. So what we're gonna do in this episode, listener, is hopefully we're gonna bring it home. We're gonna be able to kind of wrap it all together in a way that makes a coherent whole of the story we've been trying to tell. And we've got a couple of listener comments that we want to address. And kind of, maybe point to the future a little bit and just see, but we're going to try to tie it together as we're going along there. So to do that, I wanted to, remember what we talked about last time in Frampton Comes Alive? It wasn't Frampton Comes Alive. Sorry, people are going, really? He played Frampton Comes Alive?
What?
It's a musical. It's a musical podcast?
I'd listen to that.
We did.
Do I listen?
Yeah.
I thought you were talking to the listener there for a second. We talked about so much. Please refresh me.
But the resurrection.
Yes.
We were talking about the resurrection. Yes. And the reason the resurrection, because it's the central argument. We're going to come back to that later, so we'll save it.
Right.
But again, for the listener, the whole journey, we'll probably say this multiple times, the whole journey is a connection to the historical, facts and evidence. Because when you're confronted with a story that seems extravagant or crazy, the easy answer is to go, well, that couldn't have happened. Mm-hmm. And then conclude from there that has some negative impact on the story that we're being told, back to the whole elephants can't climb the mountains thing. Mm-hmm. So as an example of this, there is one crazy story. And I mean, we're already dealing with the story where a dude walks on water.
Right.
But this story is over the top. And I was literally in church just the other day, and I forget how it came up, and I might have just been maybe not paying attention to the pastor. Sorry, pastor, if you're listening to this. But and I'm reading in Matthew. Matthew's one of the four gospel writers. He tells a story that at the time of Jesus' death, here's what he writes. This is in Matthew 27, if somebody wants to look it up. He talks about the curtain in the sanctuary. That's not the point. There's this big thing happens. That's repeated by a couple of these guys. But here, out of nowhere, he goes, the earth shook, rocks split apart, and tombs opened. Now, you guys are listening to this right at near Halloween time or right past Halloween. So tombs opening. We got zombies or something. The bodies of many godly men and women who had died were raised from the dead. They left the cemetery. It says after Jesus' resurrection. There's some questions in the scripture about in the actual Greek, like what? They went into the holy city of Jerusalem and appeared to many people. Here's the bottom line. You got a bunch of people coming out of graves. This says it says they came out after he died. Then there's another little addendum in the next verse that maybe it was after he was resurrected. Mm-hmm. But regardless, it's one thing. I mean, it's one enough to say one guy came back to life. Now there's a whole crew of people.
Yeah. Yeah, and that feels like that would merit a mention in all of the Gospels.
Yeah, and it's not.
And, okay, so it's just in Matthew. Every Easter we go through the same. That story's never.
Yeah, nobody
when you
mentions
brought
that.
it up, you're like, I totally know that story, but also, you're right. Nobody ever touches on this.
That's never preached from any kind of pulpit.
Yeah, and it's really cool.
And you know why it's not preached? Because it's crazy sounding.
It's bonkers.
It's out there. Of course, somebody could say, if they were trying to tell this true story, why would they ever add something crazy? So you can take that probably one of two ways. But for the historian, we've got some hard questions, right? So like you said, it's already mentioned in one source. So that's a knock against it, right? But that doesn't discredit it on its own. So how do we approach this? Because I want to approach this seriously as a historian, right? I've got this in a source that I've already verified as trustworthy broadly. And that's the first thing. Remember one thing, so start with this concept. You have to give the source the benefit of the doubt until it proves itself false. Now, you could say, well, this proves itself false. It's like, yes, maybe. But at this point, all we can say is that it's an extravagant or a crazy sounding story, but you don't have any evidence that it's true or false, as opposed to saying some other thing that you've proven through another piece of evidence archaeologically or through other historical evidence that, okay, what he said here, he's wrong. It just did not happen that way. Here's the second thing, right? You have to consider the worldview. Meaning the worldview that we're suggesting, and the Bible certainly is suggesting, is that the world is inhabited, guided, and created by a God. And they would argue the only all-powerful God of the universe. So in that setting, obviously this is a non-human thing. For all the zombie movies everybody loves, nobody actually thinks those are true. Nobody's expecting that to happen, right? So then there's this feeling of like, okay, well, that can't happen. But wait, in a world that's inhabited by a God, could it happen? And the answer is clearly yes. If there's a God who made everything, it, he, she, they, and they can do it at once, even something that's outside of the realm of non-human. And as I already said, we've already got other evidences like this. They're proposing that through this guy, Jesus, there are these other non-things, the multiplying of fish and bread, right? The walking on water, those things. So then our question should not be, is such a story likely, but has the case been made by the overarching evidence that we do live in a world with this God? If no, then yeah, we can just laugh and go, these guys are crazy. But if the evidence is saying, wait a minute, it's clearly strong and accurate, may not be the word I want to use, but it's sustained historical evidence. Now, even though I'll use the other example, I don't think elephants can climb mountains, I have to be confronted with, well, I mean, the evidence is there saying it did happen, even if it seems fantastical to me. So when you say, okay, well, what evidence is there that there's a world with a God? Okay, on the broadest level, the Bible in total is telling this one story, so that's the evidence. And we've talked in this last several episodes about the validity, or some would say lack thereof, about the Bible. So, but we don't need to even think about all that, like all this whole story the Bible is saying. We can get narrow and decide here's the biggest piece, because the Bible itself makes this claim about Jesus. And so now then, fifth, I then have to confront what is a shocking claim that Christianity is making. And again, it's not Christians like you and me living today. I mean, yes, we are, but we're only saying it because the original evidence says it. So this isn't something that was created in 1200 and then we're all running with it over the last 800 years or so. This was from the original evidence, and the shocking claim is not that there's a religious figure who tells us how to live or tells us how to be kind or even tells us how to connect with this supposed world of this God, which you get in, I think, every other religion, that there's a leader or a famous figure who tells you about the religion and the God of that religion or gods. Here, again, I'm just going to say shockingly, what this evidence says is you have this human character who claims he is God and not a second or another God, but that very God. And I just want to pause for a second. Do you see the point?
Yeah.
It's not like the Bible is saying that there's a world with a God, and then there's some other religious book that told us about Jesus, and then somebody, again, on the 500s triangulates those. The actual Bible, the scriptures of the Jewish people, of what Christians call the Old Testament, and in these writings of this New Testament, are telling one overarching story about, the phrase I've used here is the maker, just trying to help people get past any religious baggage of hearing the word God.
Right.
That there's a maker, he's done this thing, and I use he in a sense hesitantly, the God has done this thing, right? And, what we've trying to see is that this story is coherent as a total. So I mentioned this guy's name before, Tim Mackey. Mm-hmm. He says it this way: the Bible is an epic, unified story consisting of hundreds of smaller stories, poems, and letters that all lead to Jesus. Now, I would say they all lead to the Savior of the Maker's plan. Because remember, the plan gets corrupted. The Maker then puts in motion a plan to heal everything, using the metaphors that they give us to take us back to the garden. It just so happens it's this guy named Jesus is who this works through.
Mm-hmm.
And so here's this setting, and this guy Jesus goes, well, I'm that Savior. And so if the claim about Jesus is unfounded, then we can ignore or write off the entire story of the Bible.
Right.
And certainly can write off this silly story of bodies coming out of these graves. So that's why this is the way to think about it logically. I don't have to attack the Bible. I don't have to argue about Noah or Job or whether there was a giant killed by a boy in a slingshot, because the whole story from Genesis to Revelation hangs on this thing of there being a maker who tried to save the thing he made through, in essence, himself. And I know there's a lot of religious complications of getting into there, like, well, who is Jesus? But just stay with me at the broad level.
Mm-hmm.
And if I can prove that didn't happen, if I can prove this Jesus thing is ridiculous, well, then the whole thing falls apart.
Mm-hmm. And the Bible itself gets at that.
Exactly.
It says it's not academic matter if he didn't rise from the dead.
Like we said last time, they say repeatedly, this is the central point,
Right.
which is why we spent so much time in the last episode going into it. And just to kind of wrap up this thing about the crazy thing about the graves, right? So we have this claim that Jesus says he is God, but then it's even more, again, ridiculous because he says, hey, look, they're going to kill me. Now, that's easy to kind of prophesy because, you could just get people ticked off enough that they kill you.
Right.
But he says, they're going to kill me, and in 3 days, I'm coming back. This is repeated not once, not twice, multiple times in the historical sources. So again, the Bible itself, that thing we call the Bible, the historical documents, particularly for the Jesus followers, the thing we call the New Testament, is not backing down from this fantastical, stupendous type of claim. And so you would never put that in there if that was ridiculous. So our evidence that we deeply examined in the previous episode is that he did come back to life. As we concluded there, go back and listen to it, listener. If you're listening to this for the very first one, you haven't, go back one. The evidence is overwhelming. You have throughout the Bible specific statements. These are things called prophecy by the religious leaders, but there are all these statements about who this Savior figure will be, where that figure will be born, aspects of how they'll live, how they'll live, how they'll be killed. There's specific statements that describe remarkably what crucifixion actually looks like, and it was written some 400 or 500 years before it was even created. By the Persians. The Persians came up with this great way to kill people. Alexander brought it back basically to Europe, and the Romans learned it from the Macedonians and from, to some degree, the Phoenicians. They perfected it. I mean, it is crazy, and the evidence supports all of that. And so when we investigate Jesus, we're told he predicts his death, that he predicts he'll come back to life. This is him predicting the impossible for a human. No human could do that. But for a God. So when the evidence says that something happened, as we did examine it, regardless of how I feel about it, like I don't feel like bodies can come out of, that is literally, I don't like horror movies. I don't watch anything scary. My kids, one of my kids in particular kind of laughs at me. They just know it's not my thing. I don't do scary, right? I got ruined as a kid with what not actually is probably a very scary movie, but it ruined me as a kid, and I don't do scary, all right? So I'm out. And here's the Bible describing, like, put some, what's the fake fog on the ground and put some scary music in. And remember, there was an eclipse, so it was dark when it's all happening, and then Carl's running the other way. I'm not going to get into this. I don't want this to be true at one level. There's a part of me that this freaks me out. I'm glad nobody preaches about it at Easter. But regardless of how Carl feels about it, the evidence confronts Carl the historian. And again, this is why the historical evidence for the resurrection is so crucial, and that the Bible is the central focus of support for this thing we call Christianity.
Well, you mentioned the Bible being the central focus, and our listeners, and thank you for listening along with entire season. We got a comment from a listener about the Bible being the central focus. So I will read that quote. You, Carl, said something along the lines that the Bible is the center of the Christian faith, though, of course, it's actually Jesus. I knew or think I know what you were doing and saying. I simply wanted to engage it in a more public format, end quote. All right. Over to you, Dr. Kreisman.
Good. That's a good question. I get it. I take it from the listener. They probably are a Christian or consider themselves a Christian.
Mm-hmm.
Remember, we're approaching for the whole episode, the whole series, things like a historian rather than a theologian. So we're going there first. And so Jesus as this figure only exists because of the evidence. Remember I told you the whole saw if a tree falls in a forest, does it make a sound?
Mm-hmm.
The answer is yes. Sound waves are produced, but does anybody hear it? That's the way it's said, right?
Right.
Tree falls in a forest and nobody wrote down there was ever a forest. Does the forest ever exist? And the answer is no. It ceases to exist. Nobody knows. They just see a big desert or they see a lake, and there's no way to know because nobody wrote. Now, if someone wrote down, when they dammed the Tennessee River, I'm from East Tennessee, and they made all the dams on the Tennessee during FDR's time and going into World War II and TVA project and all that kind of stuff. There are people alive whose families lost land there, and they can tell you, yeah, there's a lake there now, but if you could go down, you'd find my house. Or my ancestors' house.
Wow.
Right? So they know. So it's not lost to us kind of a thing. So the claims about him, which again, we really go in deep on episode 8, are only true because of the historical evidence. So with that, and though there is also obviously some non-Christian evidence, which we talked about, the evidence for Jesus and hence the Christian faith itself is only the Bible. And thus, it's the center of the Christian faith. That's why for the past, I would say 300 years for sure, there's been a concerted effort by a variety of different people who are not Christians to want to attack the validity of the Bible because they recognize if I can take away the evidence, then all you have are religious claims. And so then obviously people can be Christians if they want to, but it's just sort of fake in that process. And again, this is not just true for Christianity. This is true for everything. So, for instance, I've mentioned Charlemagne. He's one of the great figures who comes in the late 700s AD, kind of leading through into a major moment. He's from a people group called the Franks. He has ancestors that we know of, but those sources are very limited. So we have a limited knowledge of all the various things that he did. And as historians, we would love to have more. We're confident of the story, of the narrative. But we have to maintain some openness that some details are unclear to us. So again, the point of making it is the evidence, right? And for Charlemagne himself, we know the principal history through his own chronicler, a guy named Einhard. And he wrote that somewhere around 830, which is, just a couple of decades. He's a sympathetic witness. So we're like, well, but he liked Charlemagne and he was in the employ of Charlemagne.
Okay.
So maybe he's fudging a few things here and there.
Yeah.
It's the only evidence we have. We have 4 biographies of Jesus. We only have 1 of Charlemagne that we can really count on. But it's written close in time, so that part's good.
Okay, so let's pause a minute on the bio thing because I would think you're living in the midst of some historically significant person. Surely, like contemporaneously, somebody is writing these things down, but that's not like necessarily the case, right? For like an Alexander the Great, when do we get more formalized summary biographies of these people? When does that start popping up?
Yeah, that's a great question. And in fact, it's a point, you're making a point back to Jesus. So the closer you get to the printing press, so 1450s, 1500s AD, the closer you get to having contemporaneous biographies or good enough, multiple accounts of a figure that we then can say, we know of this person. And really, in some cases, I would say not until you're past that time. So, Henry VIII comes to the throne in I'm going to mess it up. I think 1507, early 1500s, right? So that's right at the time of the printing press. So you start having more for him. Elizabeth, his daughter, comes to the throne 60 some odd years later, 50 some odd years later. We have more for her. So when you go back into antiquity, like having this from Einhard about Charlemagne is wonderful because it is, it's within 30 years. So we feel detail-wise we're trusting it. There's just the fact that he's in the employ of the Franks and Charlemagne's son who becomes the next leader. We're kind of like, maybe he was fudging on some of the hard details, right? But when you go further back in cases, and you mentioned Alexander the Great, our best biographies of him are 300 years old, 400 years old. So imagine all we know about George Washington was written 400 years after.
Wow.
It'd be better than nothing.
Right.
And we wouldn't necessarily just say, it must be lies or it must be untrue. But remember, that's about the length of time it takes for myth and legend to work in. So, the person who's studying that figure later, maybe thousands of years later, has to be aware that, it's possible that some of what is written here does strain credulity.
Yeah.
And we don't have anything closer. So then when you look at Jesus and you go, within 30-ish years, John's a little longer, so maybe 50 to 60 years for John's account. I've got 3-4 solid writings. It's amazing. With Alexander, historians are able to look and say, okay, look, we've got remember, archaeology forms the collaborative evidence. It kind of helps corroborate the story. So if I say he was there and then I go to that site and I can dig up a battle site, I go, okay, well, the source said there was a battle there. Look, there's stuff here. Is it dated at the right time? They look for weapons. They found coins. We've got city ruins. One thing Alexander did is he built like 70 some odd cities and named almost all of them after himself. So, you can find that. There's statues. There are some tablets and some inscriptions, Babylonian and Persian. So we've got that information. But, a better example of what we're trying to get to is the British story about King Arthur. You know King Arthur, the King Arthur legend?
Yeah. A bunch of movies made.
Remember
the historical documentary, Monty Python and the Holy
exactly.
Grail?
I think Monty Python's the one we all go to, right? And there's a great scene of him confronting the peasants, and he's like, well, how did you become king? Oh, the Lady of the Lake gave me Excalibur, and he holds it up, and then the other guy's like, some watery tart giving you a sword out of a pond is no system of governance.
So funny.
It is funny, right? But look, the Arthurian legend, the Round Table, equality, chivalry, there's a lot of things over the last 1,000 years of European or Western history that one could trace into the Arthurian legend. And there's some aspects, and some will say this, that legend connects into Christianity, but just leave Christianity out of it for now. Just you got this legend of this guy who was the first true British king, and there was a nobility to his character and his life. And so this idea of character, of equality, of opportunity, of agency for everybody, blah, 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 that carries a lot of weight. So we're like, okay, well, what's the deal with that guy, right? Do we have anything about that guy? And it really developed the story, I'll say the story, around the 1100s AD. And then it was in the ether. And then, as you said, 19th and 20th century, it's all over the place. You can't really, Camelot, the play, if you know the history behind President Kennedy, Camelot was referenced as, and why was it referenced for Kennedy? Because it seemed to match the ethos of the Arthurian legend, right? And so the problem is we don't have a lot of primary sources that tell us his story, right? We have a couple of things, right? So there's one history and there's a lot of poems. There's a history from mostly they're Welsh sources. So the idea is this Arthur may be Welsh. There's a guy named Gildas who wrote of a battle. It's the Battle of Mons Badonacus. I put it in English, the Battle of Mount Badon, or you'll also see the Battle of Badon Hill. So this is a thing in the sources. Happened around 500 AD. Gildas wrote this kind of history about this, but he actually never mentions a man named Arthur at all, right? What he mentions is this major battle between the British people and the Saxons. The Saxons are defeated, and he basically gives the major reason for the victory to this British leader. It's a guy named Ambrosius Arlanius, and he's a Roman British person. So the Romans had been there; they had left. He was born there, and what Gilda says that he won some battles, but he lost some others.
That's a great historic detail.
Yeah. Now, if somebody's like, what's that got to do with Arthur? Well, in the writing, he's often referred to as Bear or the Bear. A lot of these guys in history get these cool nicknames. I want a cool nickname.
That's rad.
Yeah. And in the Celtic, bear is the word artos. Okay, hang that thought. So the claim that the legendary Arthur, the King Arthur, is based on this guy is connected to that word artos because Arthur is a Welsh name, but it comes from a Roman family name of Arturius. And if any of you out there saw the Clive Owen movie of about 15 years ago, that's the link they make. So his character and the whole thing is called Arturius.
Okay.
In that movie. It's a very good movie about the King Arthur story. And so here's the connection, right? Arturius is the word for bear, and is the word for Arthur in the kind of Roman Welsh way, and then bear is Artos. So Artos, Arturius, Arthur.
Okay.
So the argument is this guy, Ambrosius Arlanius, is actually the stand-in for Arthur.
Huh.
Okay, fair enough, right? Were you gonna say something?
No, I'm taking notes.
Okay. Again, so where is this happening in time and space? Remember, the British Isles, most of it up to Scotland, were controlled by the Romans for most of the AD period. And when you get to around the 300-400s, they start pulling back because of the coming of the collapse of the Roman Empire in the West. And so when they pull back, there's invasions that occur to the Brits from the north, the Scots, the Picts, and then generally what we say is from the Germanic lands, the Angles and the Saxons. So one could argue, and there is an argument to be made, that actually some of the regular inhabitants of the lower part of the island asked for aid from the Saxons. Now, if you watch the movie with Clive Owen, which I think is called just Arthur, but now don't quote me on that. Clive Owen, look for a young Keira Knightley is in this movie. It's one of her early movies that she made. She's one of the allies who come in and help this Arturius. It's a really good movie if you like, swords and kind of older battle scenes and that kind of stuff. And so in that movie, the Saxons are not coming to help anybody. They're just invading and they're evil and all this kind of stuff. But regardless, the Saxons are here. And what Gildas tells us, the Venerable Bede, another century later, tells us similar stuff. There's some poetry that is written in the 8th and 9th century in Welsh that basically this Saxon invasion, it is stopped at this Battle of Baden Hill, right? So then you have this guy, the people rally around him. And again, then the hero, Ambrosius Arlanius, the bear, Artos, Arturius, maybe that's Arthur.
Okay.
Right? 300 years later, the word Arthur itself actually appears in the writings of another Welsh historian named Nennius, who gave a list of 12 battles the warrior king supposedly fought. Kind of problem is that if you know where the battles are, they happen in time and place where no one person could actually be at all of them. But it sounds good.
Yeah.
And there's a lot of poetry, not a lot, but there's several significant pieces of poetry from 6th and 7th century, so around the same, within a century of this. I was going to try and do this Welsh poem's name in Welsh, but I can't do it. So there's a Welsh poem. I'll put a link in the show notes. And it's stated in a pretty broad frame. But a lot of people think it's from the 7th century. So, but in it, it talks about there's another warrior, Gwadur, sounds like a Tolkien name. The Gwadur was skilled at slaying his enemies, but he was no Arthur.
Oh, solid burn.
So the poem says that, right? So maybe there was a skilled warrior named Arthur who's known, but we don't get the legend. None of this has anything to do with Excalibur, a chick named Guinevere,
right?
Round Table, Lady of the Lake, Merlin, because all that stuff is legendary. That's all just added in.
Right.
And that story begins to be built, like I said, around the 1100s. There's a Celtic cleric named Geoffrey of Monmouth. And he writes a history of the kings of Britain. And he sets out the Arthurian legend that we know in the modern era. Lancelot's involved. Merlin's involved. He doesn't actually name the sword Excalibur. He names the sword Caliburnus. I don't, so how do we get that, Excalibur? And again, here's the point. We're looking at things about the evidence. Back to the question from the listener. There's a listener saying, wait, the Bible is not the central part. Jesus is the central part. And my short version is, well, there's no Jesus without the evidence. Sorry. I understand why a Christian would say that's not true, and they would have a big argument. From a historical point of view, there's no Jesus without the Bible. The Bible is the only way we know of this. And we know of this through this great evidence about the Bible. And so then the evidence for Jesus is so overwhelmingly good. And you can look then at something like the Arthurian legends, which is not a silly thing. I probably would, I really love the Clive Owen movie. Mm-hmm. And I lean into saying, yeah, I think I'm convinced from not just the movie, of course, but from the evidence that there was a Roman British warrior who fought and had some sort of a name that later, through time, because again, the evidence is so poorly preserved, becomes Arthur. And maybe he was called Arthur. I don't have to fight that fight. I'm happy with just saying there was this warrior, he did this thing, and that's the kind of maybe beginnings of the British concept, right? Of we're something by ourselves. We're not with those people in the north, the Scots, and we're not with these people south of us, the Romans. We're our own people, right? But in that, again, that legend is huge. It is so many things. Like I told you, remember the quest for the Holy Grail? You mentioned Monty Python. Where do they get that from? They get that from that legend. But what was that about? That's the idea of a person going on a noble spiritual adventure. What is all the Round Table's guys supposed to do? They're supposed to defend the weak. They're supposed to be ones for equality, right? The idea of a fair government, of freedom, of justice. So these are things that people lean into and believe in our current day, but they believe it on, I would say, a story that has weak evidence. All those things, maybe not necessarily knights going on a quest, although you could look at the life of Paul and say, but are going down a road of where they're really taking it from a better story with better evidence.
Well, talking about names and Paul, have another comment from a listener. It's a little bit more involved. So at one point we had talked about the change in Saul's name from Saul to Paul. So,
we got called out on that, didn't we?
Yeah, we did. Well, it's funny. I grew up just understanding, being told, it's Saul. He had this experience, this life-changing experience on the road to Damascus, and then now it's Paul. And you're like, well, maybe, but maybe not.
Yeah.
It's not spelled out with that degree of specificity. So here's what our listener shared with us. Carl, Paul was a Jew born in the Roman city of Tarsus, between current-day cities of Adana and Mersin in Turkey, right in the crook in the land there. It's close to Cyprus, which is where Acts 13:4 says he went on his first missionary journey with his friend Barnabas. At that point, the narrative still calls him Saul. So, this source I was sent says that, quote, he was proud of his Jewish heritage, and thus as zealous and devout was he that persecuting Christians was the natural way for him to show his devotion. He chose to use his Hebrew name, Saul, until sometime after he began to believe in and preach Christ, end quote. Then adding more, quote, it is interesting that Paul began using his Roman name on Cyprus when the Roman proconsul on that island was converted. That's in Acts 13:12. This was during Paul's first missionary journey and involved a high-ranking, idolatrous Gentile coming to faith in Christ, end quote.
Yeah, so the argument is that he just had two names, Saul and Paul.
Yeah.
And, we both said we don't know, and so that's plausible. I mean, like it says basically in that same scripture spot that he was known as Paul, and now he goes with Saul. Or that thing.
I worked with a woman. Her name was Melinda, and then parted from that company. She went to a different company, and then I see her social post, and it was Mindy. And then, so elsewhere, it was Mel. So Melinda, Mel, Mindy, It's the same woman.
Yeah.
Different places, different names at different times. It's like, it's totally understandable.
Well, so there's a character in this same passage, by the way, but we know this guy because we've talked about his evidence of the guy named Mark. Well, there's a guy in the Acts story that most everybody who studies the Bible, not everybody, believes that he's the Mark of this book, but he's called John Mark. But it says very clearly, Luke writes it, his name is John Mark. And so then later we just see him as Mark, and that's kind of, okay, yeah. So I know people who have two names. Many people have two names, but only my mother calls me Carl Edward. And so, nobody calls me Eddie or Edward or Ed. It's just Carl.
Yeah.
Right? And so I wish Luke, who was very clear about John Mark, was equally as clear for me to be convinced that his name was Saul Paul.
There's a couple times in the Bible where we have people with the same names. I'm like, guys, if you were writing this, you would not do that.
Exactly.
That's a thing in storytelling. You're like, we're going to have this screenplay or this novel. Clearly, 3 of the people are named George. You're like, no, what? No. Anyway,
yeah. There's
off topic.
There's no evidence, but I'm willing for the listener. I will concede to the listener, having looked at the writings in Luke a little better, because we said we don't know where this is. And so this listener was like, yeah, it is. It's right there. It's like, okay, you know what? Fair enough. He was born in Tarsus, as you said. It's basically, if you look at a map, it's the crook of where Asia Minor, which is modern-day Turkey, is going east-west and then makes a sharp turn and starts going down south, where modern-day Syria, Lebanon, Israel, Gaza are all located on that line. And it's right in that corner. So it would have been Roman, not Jewish. So I don't know. Maybe when he went to school, because he went to school in Jerusalem, because he wasn't from the current lands of quote unquote the Holy Land, he thought maybe I need to use another name. We don't know. So we got Saul, we got Paul. Okay. So let's wrap it up. We're definitely not going along like we did last time. So in all this kind of talking and wrapping us up here, one of the key things I wanted to make sure we got our head on straight about is the whole podcast is connecting to the previous podcast. And in the very first episode, I referenced how we closed that podcast. And we ended that series posing the question, well, is Christianity still useful for us? And what we're trying to do here, and I guess you could say, well, you didn't answer that question. Okay, you're right. But what I was trying to say is I don't even want to talk about that question if I can prove Christianity is false. If Christianity is just a religious thing that people do, we don't even need to talk about it in our society, trying to say that we could help our society be stronger if we brought Christianity more into focus in our society. So that's kind of the point here, was to say, well, let's even see if it's got validity. The way I ended, and I quoted this in episode 1, we'll say it again. This is the way I ended Unmoored, or part of the ending at Unmoored. I think it was episode 11, but it might have been 12. It was that I concede in the early 21st century, when we are clearly no longer, quote unquote, a nation peopled mostly with Christians. So the discussion could be, why choose Christianity today? And my point in this podcast, that meaning in Unmoored, has been to simply note our current distress as a civic entity is due to the fact that our system depends upon that foundation of morality and virtue. Without it, we end up in a might makes right setting it's the historical norm. Every other nation in world history, both in antiquity and present day, deal with. Not every nation is that way, because some do elections and stuff. But if you don't have the moral virtue foundation, you end up with, I just have the most power, I'm going to make you do it. And if you are looking around our own country, not only in the year 2025, but I would suggest over the past 40, 50 years, you could make an argument we're already into that period where one political party acts like they've got all the power and they do things. The other one gets mad, and then they get the power and they do things. So back to my quote here from Unmoored. Quote, my hope is to have sparked your curiosity to think about how we could restore some internal spiritual foundation. I'm not saying at that moment in 2024 when we made that podcast that it must be Christianity. I am saying, though, that it was Christianity. Unquote. So this podcast uncovered the Bible as a historical document, has been digging into that. So Now we're at the end. What have we discovered? Matthew, you got any thoughts about what you think we've discovered?
Well, I don't know if these are the most important ones, but in reviewing our episodes, I came up with just 3 favorite little things that we touched on that I found fascinating. One, in talking about the documents that we have, and we talked about the autograph. That is an original document. We don't have any of those.
Nope.
So you have to look at the copies and then evaluate how reliable are those. And if memory is serving, we have something like 25,000
For the New Testament.
Testament pieces of manuscripts,
Yeah.
which is just far and away more than any other contemporary antique.
The average is about 200, maybe 150. The Iliad is kind of next in line from a non-religious point. Well, it's religious. It has about 5,500.
Yeah.
The Old Testament has about 10,000. It's kind of counted a little differently, but 25,000. I mean, it's as we use the phrase "blowing the curve" for those of you who remember graded curves and stuff. But yeah,
that's amazing. Yep. Other is, it just feels like something I should have known, but we brought some clarity to it when we visited it. The Council of Nicaea. It was not a big convention. It was not BibleCon where they're like, "All right, guys, seriously, settle down. Let's vote on which things are going to get into the Bible." You're like, it was understood which ones were, legitimate and which ones were kind of works of fan fiction. Which is a great way, kind of a fun way of looking at it.
Yeah. So in the council, in one sense, the easy way to say it is what you just said. It has nothing to do with the Bible. It's very important in Christianity, and it's a huge moment, as we talked about in Unmoored, relative to what Constantine does and what happens to Christianity. But as far as this part about the historicity of the Bible, it's like, I got nothing to do with it.
Yeah, it's kind of more formalizing broadly accepted consensus already. I'm like, that's really cool. And I tell you, we talk about kind of apologetics, that word of just looking at evidence and what does that suggest about what the Bible says about itself. And, there's so many classic examples of why you might say that the Bible is true, the gospel is true. For example, the people who knew Jesus dying for a lie, if it was a lie, that doesn't stand. It's more of a logical, inductive way of getting to it, but it still is valid. But the one that I had never thought about before was the impact of the gospel of Christianity on Jewish culture. This is a people who have been attacked by everybody, persecuted, driven out, and they don't change. They don't change. I love how hard-headed they are. They're like, this is what we do. These are our traditions. These are our festivals. Until the advent of Jesus and his life and ministry and death and resurrection. And then all of a sudden,
almost on a dime,
it's a massive pivot for a subset of this group of people when literally nothing else for hundreds and thousands of years could make any kind of dent or inroads in that kind of thing. And like you said, overnight, virtually, they are definitely going in a different direction to great peril, at great risk and sacrifice on their own to do that. That objectively, anybody would have to go, that at least means something.
Something is, that's the good way to put it. For all the evidences, when we looked at the resurrection piece last episode, something has to explain it. You can't just say, it was made up at some place or some mythical thing has gone on that people in the 21st century are just hanging on to. It's like, no. There's all these things that you've got to come up with an answer for. And the deal is that there is no answer. I mean, except the one that's presented as the best plausible answer based on the evidence. And it's amazing. Well, we've tried to really lay out a good argument. Listener, you tell me, maybe we haven't made the case. We started with the overview in this series. We said, okay, look, we want to remind us what the founders said. But then we also talked about, remember in episode 1, we talked about how modern research on flourishing has come to see the importance of faith and the actual reading of the Bible. It's kind of like, wow. And so we talked about that. I would even say, although it's not because of our podcast, I would even say that it seems like our take that we came out of from Unmoored is gaining some traction, because you look around our world, there's a lot of different people, some of which are really famous for their atheism or their opposition to Christianity, who are agreeing, not with Christianity necessarily, but they're agreeing with the take you and I are saying, that the system we're trying to protect as in this society, governmentally, the government of the people, it won't work. It won't work, just like the founders said, if we don't have this. So that's very interesting. And then we said, episode 2 and 3, kind of looking at what's going on with history. How's history work? What historians do? Because I wanted to make sure everybody realized we're going to use some rules here, and we applied those rules then to the Bible. And again, a phrase I've used a lot is that the Bible it's like a library of 66 ancient manuscripts. These are discrete writings. They span 1,600 years. There's 40 different writers, lots of different languages. But as we said earlier, one story, and historically supported, sustained. And then we talked about, as you were referencing there with Nicaea, we took 3 episodes, 4, 5, and 6, to talk about why these 66. Because it's worth noting that there's other historical writings in broadly the same time period. And since Nicaea is in 340, talking about Alexander the Great, something could have been written in the 300s. They go, yeah, we're going to put that in the Bible. And then you and me, 1,700 years later, would maybe not know any better, or we just go, well, it's in the Bible, even though it was written 300. Like we saw with Alexander, that could be problematic for different ways. That's not what you've got. But we said, what is the canon? What does that even mean? Kind of worked our way through. How did the Jewish leaders come to the groups they had? And that was really all ultimately locked in at the time of Jesus. So Jesus would have been reading from that. And then we said, well, what about then these writings of these current people? You got these histories. There's 5 biography histories, and the rest are basically personal letters. There's a few others that are different type of writing. That kind of fit in there. And we talked about how they were selected, some of the criteria for that. Like you said, mostly because it was what was being used at the time. Mm-hmm. And then we said, well, wait a minute. What about these other writings? Because a lot of people have gotten all jacked up about, what about the Gospel of Mary? What about the Gospel of Judas? What about the Gospel of Thomas? And so we looked at some of these. And Rissler, if you go back to episode 6, look at the show notes. I've given you links. You can read for yourself. You don't have to believe me. And then last kind of big piece, well, what if all these copies of copies, what if there's just mistakes and stuff in them? Mm-hmm. Typically, a better way to talk about it is variance between the different copies. And are there? Yes, there are. But there's not a single serious, significant claim of the Christian theology that is in dispute or questionable at all, because most of these variants are misspellings of spelling variations. Like DeLand or Deltona, which one is it? And 1,000 years later, well, I don't know. There's 2 cities that go DEL something. Mm-hmm. And so, they're trying to figure it out based on it. And then was it possible that they messed up their own story? Are there contradictions? And we just looked at that, and we talked about how we could see that same idea of quote-unquote contradictions in the story of Hannibal, the story of Julius Caesar. Those exist, but none of those contradictions make us think, there was nobody named Caesar. Or there were no elephants. Or this guy Jesus is a fiction. Nope, all the evidence is solid. And the fact that there's a few moments here and there where maybe some details that's not clear does not mean that it's false or that one of the sources has lied to us. And then, as we've said, the last episode was our biggie. We then took all that and said, okay, let's really scrutinize this claim. And so that's where we are. So we're kind of wrapping it up. We've covered it pretty well, you think?
I think we've covered a lot in a topic that we could talk about for the rest of our lives and never exhaust it.
Yeah, and I tell you what, man, I've got some evidence here. We're not going to go into it, audience. Sorry, about what they're finding in archaeology. I'll just say it this way. In the past 200 years, really the past 75 years, so really since World War II, the archaeological discovery in lots of fields of history, but including Jewish, biblical, Roman, Jesus, it's amazing what they're finding. And as a historian, I'm like, bring it, find it, and you know what they're finding? Repeatedly, every time, a corroboration with the historical narrative we already have. It's at the point now where if somebody still wants to say, I don't believe the Bible, they are intentionally denying the evidence And that, of course, raises all kinds of questions. So I don't know, audience, you may not think we made the case. I hope you can see the fact that the founders, and when I say the founders, I mean the 1.5 million or so, 2 million people who lived there at the time when the country was founded, that they believed Christianity was valid, was useful, and was true. And I hope you see that argument has merit. And if you don't, I mean, I get it. Again, feel free to ask me, email me. The email's in the in the show, in the end of the episode. It's also in the show notes and stuff. Mm-hmm. There is a part I guess I want to end with this. I feel like in the early 21st century, there's a lot of people who have this frustration with what they see when they view quote unquote Christians or Christianity. I've got some dear friends, multiple, but some dear friends who are not Christians. They have a variety of viewpoints. They're not religious. They're not another religion. Mm-hmm. They're just not into that thing. And I feel like there's times when I feel like they wish it were true. They want to believe. And it's interesting to me as we wrap this up, I'm working at the college, and I'm now working with very small group of students who are investigating Christianity. And there's a student leader, and the student leader, she said, I want to have us look at and read C.S. Lewis's very famous Mere Christianity. And, I love that. And there may be a next year podcast for you and me where we talk about not mere Christianity, but the theological and logical from a historical point of view still. We haven't really done any theology except the resurrection, so maybe we'll just go take some time and talk more about some of the theological pieces of it. But in any case, to me, the challenge for many of my non-Christian friends is that the Christianity they see is often different than the faith expressed in the Bible and as was laid out in history. And we discussed this a bit last year in Unmoored in episodes 4 and 5. Do you remember the DC Talk? You remember DC Talk, the band,
yes.
Obviously. And they had a song called What If I Stumble?
That's right.
Do you remember how it opened?
That's right. They opened with a famous quote from Brennan Manning that I love, but it's also haunting at the same time.
Oh my gosh, seriously.
And Brennan said, the greatest single cause of atheism in the world today is Christians who acknowledge Jesus with their lips and walk out the door and deny him by their lifestyle. This is what an unbelieving world simply finds unbelievable.
Audience, I mean, I'll probably put a link in the show notes too, so you can hear it. It's like a scratchy voice, and he says this kind of stuff. They were actually filming him because they'd gotten to know Brennan, the 3 artists who were in DC Talk, and they were filming him, and he must have said that there's not any of his writings. He's got some amazing writings, Ragamuffin Gospel, I think Abba Child. I highly recommend any of his. He passed away like in 2013 or 2014, I think. It's a punch in the gut, isn't it?
Yeah, it's something that merits like a larger discussion. But if there's somebody who's an atheist who feels that disconnect, I'm like, that's a logical takeaway. There's more to it, but you're following the evidence. This doesn't match with this. We're like, fair call.
Yeah. And I feel for it. And then that's the key thing, right? Because Christianity, you're saying it's not only useful, as the founders proposed, but it's true. This is the true story. And I'd love to talk with anybody who goes, I still don't get it. The idea of the maker. He wants a relationship. He doesn't want a religion. And sadly, I get it where my friends, like I said, I think they actually wish Christianity were true, that they could see what I see, that they could believe, and they sadly turn away because what they see that's claimed about Christianity in the modern world, they find deep at odds with. And obviously there's a lot longer story there, but just, I guess, in closing, literally this past week, again, part of my devotional time that I spend, I read the Bible every day, have pretty much for all of my 61 years. And this year I've been reading through the Psalms repeatedly. And just this past week, I read Psalm 40. And Psalm 40 is a beautiful psalm. Some of you may know it better from U2's song entitled 40. I waited patiently for the Lord. No, 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 no. I'll probably put that link in there too. You can hear Bono do it much better than I just tried to do it. And that psalm has a lot of ground that it covers. But in verses 6 through 8, it says this: David's writing, and he says this about God. You take no delight in sacrifices or offerings. Now that you have made me listen, I finally understand. You don't require burnt offerings or sin offerings. And then he goes on to say, I take joy in doing your will, my God, for your instructions are written on my heart. Now, listener, don't get confused with sacrifice. I'm going to make it modern. You take no delight in church attendance or religious pious prayers. You don't require certain kind of almsgiving or sacrificial doing to make me right with you. So there's a lot more to that, I could say.
Yeah.
But if you read, and we hammered on this a little bit in Unmoored, but if you will read the Bible and you look and you say, well, what's God's opinion about the religious thing? Repeatedly, he will declare he's not into religion, and especially religious acts from people who are disconnected from living in the way that he says. He wants those who follow him, those who claim his name, to live in his ways, to delight in his ways. And those ways, they're kind of upside down. They're kind of weird. It's the leader Jesus getting on his hands and knees and washing your feet. And actually what that does end up showing us, I think, and this is the point of, again, we're broken, we need to get back to the garden, is that when we think I have a normal understanding of life, the world's upside down. And so actually the maker and through Jesus and God, he's saying, I'm going to show you how to live life right side up. Look, there's a long list. I'm not going to read them all out where we're told this repeatedly. I'm not into this religious stuff, particularly when you're doing it to try to supposedly impress me as God. I want you to live a certain way. That's what he's nailing into. And so, and you see this in the New Testament, by the way. Look, God, if you know the maker, if you know the God of this world, I'll leave you with this, listener. He does want you to know him, and he does want you to worship. He does want to commune with you and have you do things in celebration that comes with it. So, it's not a rejection of any specific type of thing, but it's a rejection of making it fake, which again is what I think my friends and a lot of people stumble over. And what's going on in your heart and then how that's manifested in your lives daily, the Maker wants this ongoing relationship with you. And then he wants to see you live it out. That then helps bring forward us getting closer to the garden. And that's my prayer for you, listener, that you will say, I am at least intrigued. I have to not be blocked by the fact that when I look around and see quote unquote Christians or quote unquote Christianity, I'm turned off. I'm intrigued by both the historical side of what this meant to the civic structure and this historical evidence that, this is like a true story. The Maker wants to meet you, is there, and wants to commune. I know there's more conversation down the road from that. That's for another time. We've had a blast going through this.
This has been amazing.
Been a blast, been a blessing. And this is us signing off. Thank you so much for staying with us.
Thanks.
Thanks for joining us on Uncovered, the Bible as Historical Document. Be sure to follow or subscribe so you don't miss any episodes. If you have questions or comments, drop an email to carl@carlkreisman.com. This episode was produced and edited by Carl Kreisman and recorded at the Winter Park Public Library. The Winter Park Library promotes the free and open exchange of ideas and does not attempt to control or take responsibility for any opinions that may be expressed in this podcast. Opinions expressed in this podcast do not constitute or imply an endorsement or a reflection of the library's policies or beliefs. Our theme music was written and performed by Kyle Williams. A big thank you to everyone who supports this show. And if you'd like to help, visit carlkreisman.com/uncovered.